Thanks, Janice. Now we need to pray for sure. Let's pray. Father, thanks for your love and your mercy and your grace. Again, grab us from wherever we are, where we were this morning, where we're going today, and put our hearts and minds in the right place. Help us to follow you and serve you. Pray that everybody that comes out of this conference, Father, will really be impacted and have a passion for reaching lost sheep. Help us to honor you this morning and understand what those around us are saying so we can better minister to them. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All the Baptists in the room back here in the back. Well, you children need to gather around. I have a story to tell. We're talking about Niezsche, the death of God in the emerging church. I could tell you all sorts of different things. I could bore you to no end with some of the different streams that go into the swamp of the emerging church and postmodernism. It's hard to understand the emerging church if you don't really understand postmodernism. The term is thrown out repeatedly, but most people not only don't understand what postmodernism, they have no clue about what modernism allegedly is. And the fact is, if you read most of the postmodern writers, you will still not understand what modernism actually is. These terms are incredibly slippery. So I could regale you with tales of Descartes and Hume and these kinds of people who helped set the stage for the Enlightenment or modernism, but they only were a part of the story. The larger part is Immanuel Kant and transcendental idealism. And if you understand a lot of what Kant is saying, you start to recognize all sorts of things about the emerging church. After Kant, you have a very important group of people called the German idealists. Most of us have never heard of these people. Names like Fichte and Schelling and Schiller and Hegel, Hegel being maybe the most famous of them all of them reacting to Kant. Several of them were Kant's students, and they're reacting to him. And if you notice in the subtitle, the title is Niezsche, the Death of God in the Emerging Church, Lusting for Freedom in All the Wrong Places. One of the things that was most interesting in the reaction to Kant, both in Germany and France, and somewhat limited in England, was this desire that Kant had somehow, in separating the noumen and the phenomenon, having all these interesting, an attempt to put both Descartes and Hume in a proper perspective from his own mind, this idea of freedom kept coming up in the German literature. Where is Kant on freedom? He's gone a little bit this way, but he hasn't gone far enough, and we need to find freedom. Also, at the exact same time, these guys are all reading the Bhagavad Gita. They're reading the Lotus Sutras. England had colonized India about 60 years before, and all these books hit the market in Germany. If you read Schilling or Schlegel, it is like reading the Bhagavad Gita. The Transcendentalists and the early Romantic writers are getting all over this stuff. Niezsche is reading Buddhist and Hindu literature in high school in Germany in the 1840s. So this stuff is all melding together and creating this weird, interesting thing. And at the exact same time as Hegel is writing, Hegel, who was a pantheist, a good Lutheran, of course, a good Lutheran pantheist, and an admirer of Napoleon, an admirer of objectivity in the way he would say it, was an understanding of the Weltgeist, the world spirit operating through history. And that's what God was. God was the forces that drive history all over the place. And so he loved Napoleon. And the fact that Napoleon killed hundreds of thousands of people was irrelevant to him. In reaction to him is Soren Kierkegaard, our depressed Dane. And Kierkegaard is reacting to this kind of stuff. And this is all setting the table for Niezsche. As Niezsche comes along and starts writing maybe 20 or 30 years after all this stuff comes up, Nietzsche is not operating in a vacuum. Now, the reason I picked on Niezsche out of all the different things, we could talk about, in fact, if you're going to understand postmodernism, you have to understand things like the structuralist movement. You have to understand the phenomenologists. You have to understand all these weird people that most of us never read, de Saussure, Levi Strauss, and Husserl. And again, these names don't mean much. Even if you take philosophy classes, you might not ever hear these guys, because only in a certain part of what's called continental philosophy did these guys get read. Nevertheless, they're all critical to understanding postmodernism. But more important than them is Niezsche. And Niezsche is considered the grandfather of the postmodern movement. He's looked at as the guy who really got this whole thing put together in a certain way. He's read by Heidegger, good little Nazi that Heidegger was. And then somehow these French writers, Derrida, Ricoeur, Foucault, all sorts of other characters, they start reading bad Germans, and what comes out is postmodernism. And so when we try to understand the emerging church and what it thinks it's valuable, what it thinks is a good, basically way of thinking that the Christian church need to glom onto, it's important for us to understand what Niezsche was really saying and how it relates and how it's come down. So that's why I picked the idea of the death of God, one of Nietzsche's more central themes, and how it affects us in the way that the church thinks, how the postmodern church or emerging church is taking on to that. And so hopefully we'll have a better understanding. So again, briefly setting the table for what Niezsche was swimming around in. Nietzsche saw Christianity as another example of Platonism. Nietzsche hated Plato, who was the original idealist, idealism being a separation between the world that is, that you perceive, and the actual world. And if you're familiar with Plato's cave, you get some illustration of that. Kant is a transcendental idealist. He takes Plato to a whole other level. But if you take Plato in his simplest idea, there is formless matter that's just floating around out there that's eternal, and then there's these ideas. There's these things up in the heavens somewhere. Could be from the gods. Nobody's really sure how Plato meant it, but it's these ideas that give shape and form and purpose and meaning and value and ethics to the world of shapeless matter. That's a very simple read on what Plato was saying. So for Nietzsche, to interpret Plato is to say that the world itself does not give value. The world doesn't have its own meaning or ethics. All it has is this stuff that's been imposed by somebody like Plato from the outside, from the heavens, from somewhere else. Nietzsche reads the history of the church, and he sees people like Augustine and others who are maybe reading a bit too much Plato into their understanding of the universe, and this is why Plato comes out, or Augustine comes out on the ascetic side of things. Nietzsche sees again proof that Christianity is really nothing but Platonism. Then he sees an alleged good Christian like Immanuel Kant over there in Vienna, and he's just taken the whole idealism up another step. The world of phenomena, the world you can actually measure, is not the real world, to use Kant's famous phrase, the Ding an sich. It's not the thing in itself. It's not the actual thing. We have no access to the actual thing. We just have the world of perception that we see. So we can't ever really know something about anything. There's a thing behind it. So I don't really know what a chair is. There's a chair thing in the noumenal world, and I can never understand what that actually is. So yeah, I can play around the perceptions, but in this sense, he made this famous distinction between the noumena and the phenomena. Phenomena is the world of measurement, world of science. He says, I've limited science or reason to make room for faith. So Hume, who's basically said all you can know is what you can measure and what you can verify, Hume's got his world, the world of the phenomena, and then Descartes has his world, the world of the noumena, where the mind can conceive of all sorts of interesting things, where you can believe literally anything you want. And it's not long after that Nietzsche is writing and reacting to this. For Nietzsche, all versions of idealism, which is what he sees Christianity as now, is a terrible disaster. The world is not ever accepted for what it actually is. It's posited as something else. So since the world is never going to look right in the eyes of the idealist tradition, or now the Christian tradition, the world is a bad thing. The world is a horrible thing. And Nietzsche says, I reject all this kind of stuff. It's all, in his words, decadent. Anything that denies the world is decadence. And I think there's a whole lot of potential Christian writing on this point at all. It's interesting that Nietzsche gloms onto Buddhism. At many points of his writing, he talks about, he calls nihilism a European form of Buddhism, which is where my dissertation is going. But of all things to say, Christianity is not world-affirming, but Buddhism somehow is. It's just one of the more interesting twists I can ever imagine. It's so backwards. But anyways, he sees Christianity as idealist, as Platonic. It rejects the world, and he says, instead of that, no, you must be a world affirmer. You must be a yay-sayer. This is his famous way of saying this. You must say yay to whatever you see in the world. Whether it's allegedly good, allegedly bad, whatever it is, you must affirm it. And his idea of the eternal recurrence, very famous theme, very similar to some ways to Eastern thought, was the idea that you must be willing to say yes to every time you come back and see the exact same thing. Whatever that thing is in the world, you must affirm it. You must be willing to say this. You must be resolute, good German now, and say this. It somehow has to be something that you can affirm. And so you can only affirm it if you have this thing out there that's putting down values and ethics and truth and all these ideas out of the way. So for Nietzsche, The death of God is not about the death of a being. For Nietzsche, the death of God is the death of an idea. It is an idea that has stifled the world forever. And most importantly, especially as it relates to what he saw as, again, this search for freedom, is it's the death of the slave master who imposes values, who imposes what's right and wrong, who tells you what's true and what's not true, who tells you what you can and what you cannot do. That's stifled with this concept of God. So when Nietzsche says in his famous words, that we'll look at in just a few minutes here, that God is dead, God is totus. When God is dead, it wasn't that he said it's like he's relating it somehow to the death of Jesus Christ or some Christian idea. Even though he's raised by a Christian minister, several of his relatives were Christian ministers. Nietzsche was saying that basically God is dead, we have killed him, and there is no good and evil. And if you look in his books, Beyond Good and Evil, or The Gay Science, or stuff like this, you see this all over the place. God is dead. And again, it's this idea. It's this thing that's out there somewhere, like a Platonic ideal, that is giving shape and form and matter, a shape and form to matter that's giving values and truth and everything else. And that's got to be rejected for the world to be affirmed. So in essence, that's how Nietzsche is arguing. Don, go ahead and switch to the next one. Let me set the story. This is Thus Spake Zarathustra, one of his last books, one of his more bizarre books. Many people in most philosophy departments don't see Nietzsche as a philosopher. He's a poet, he's a madman, he's a psychologist. Maybe that's all part of the same thing. But this is the madman who comes out of the mountains into the village. And what he's postulating is basically the idea that in the cities where people still think Christianity is true, all right, and the madman is coming down to tell them a message. It's something they ought to already know. And so that's the setting here, the madman speaking. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing there together, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him then, he said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or immigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed. Remember who these are. These are people who say they don't believe in God. Don? The madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God gone? He cried. I shall tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? It's an incredible metaphor. What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling? Next. Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions. Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as though an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is it not more and more night coming on all the time? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's too decomposed. God is dead. Again, all of this is this gigantic running metaphor or poem that he's written. But the idea is that the idea of God itself died. Where? In the heart of the Reformation, in Germany itself. In a country where there's more Christian universities and seminaries than anywhere else on the planet at the time. It's an interesting parallel when I teach on how to reach out to our Jewish friends. I grew up in a primarily Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles. One of the things that virtually every Jewish kid I ever knew understood, it didn't matter whether they were practicing, not practicing, or anything. They all knew that the Holocaust was a Christian invention. Every one of them thought that way. The day I became a Christian, I went to one of my friend's houses, one of my best friends that I played basketball with for years, and we used to smoke dope and play ball. It was a great life. And I came into his house. He and his parents were smoking some serious dope. And he says, Bill, it's so good to see you. Come on in. He says, we've got this Acapulco Gold. You've got to try this. And I said, Chuck, I don't do that anymore. He says, why? I said, Chuck, I became a Christian. He literally grabbed my arm and walked me out the door. It was the last time we ever talked. I had no idea what I'd run into. I wasn't raised a Christian. I wasn't raised anywhere near a Christian church. I had no idea where this animosity was coming from. Well, again, the Jews believe that the Holocaust is a Christian invention. And one of the two people I quote to show how wrong-headed this is Niezsche himself. Niezsche, writing in the 1870s and 1880s, is pointing out, he has a famous thing about, it's called Nietzsche's hammer. And with Nietzsche's hammer, he goes up to the idols, okay, and he taps on them to see if they're hollow or not. And so the purpose of the metaphor was to understand that Nietzsche's going to the Christian institutions. He's going to the schools. He's going to the giant churches. He's going to all these places, and he's tapping, and what is he finding? It's all hollow. Nobody believes it. Well, why does he say this? Well, this is really going back to our good friend Kant. Kant separates the facts of the world, from your faith. Kierkegaard and Schleiermacher, probably the two best, I would say, commentators on this whole move, made it really clear. If you know who Friedrich Schleiermacher was, the founder of the modern liberal church, as he's called, Schleiermacher is trying to rescue Christianity, in his famous words, from its despised accusers. In other words, he's going to all the right parties, and everybody's saying bad things about Christianity. Oh, don't you know? Hume has already showed us nobody can take seriously this idea of miracles, and oh, come on, that can't be right. Well, Schleiermacher's embarrassed by his intellectual case, and so Kant comes along to rescue the day. I don't have to have faith because of what actually happens in the world, facts, phenomena, things like this. I can have faith because that's a whole separate category. If you talk to any scientist today, that's what they'll tell you. You're hearing Kant again. Well, the science has its realm, and faith has its realm. Just keep the two separate and everybody's happy. That's pure Immanuel Kant. The liberal church basically started out of this whole movement that faith is completely separated from facts on the ground. Kierkegaard takes it again and takes it one step up. You cannot even begin to base your faith, Kierkegaard says, on a single historical event. Now think of how different that is from what the apostles said 1,800 years earlier. That is the truth of the resurrection that Christianity hangs on. And Kierkegaard said, Christianity has nothing to do with that. Christianity is not related to faith in any way. If you want to understand why people are barking like dogs and roaring like lions and clucking like chickens, it's because rationality and all these things aren't necessarily tied to faith. They're separated. Most church, great thinkers in the church had argued about the role of faith and reason, how they work together, which one is more important than the other, how do they relate that, but they'd always seen them as twin gifts from God. They both belong together. Not after Kant, not after Kierkegaard. So what's the immediate reaction in the German schools? And the German schools and the seminaries are basically the same thing. The teachers would teach at both, whether it's Jena, Munich, or Berlin. They would all literally go back and forth between schools and seminaries. Philosophers, theologians, they're all basically the same thing. What happens is almost immediately higher criticism develops. Since faith is not tied to actual fact, then what is this book over here that the Reformation made such a big stink out of? Well, it comes out as a collection of stories, and Graf Wellhausen and all these different things come up in the next 30 or 40 years. You have the search for the historical Jesus, the first version of that, kind of the predecessor to the Jesus Seminar. That comes out of this whole period again. The book is just fairy tales and stories, edited, redacted over hundreds of years. It's not an authentic history record. It's just a thing that inspires or doesn't inspire. So within 40 or 50 years of this, young Niezsche is watching this phenomena. You have the Pittsburgh Declaration on God, the Reformed movement of Judaism, coming out at basically the same time. What were the Reformed, the new Jewish seminaries in Germany saying? You don't even have to believe in God to be a Jew. They're coming to the exact same conclusion that the German schools, the Christian schools have come to. This whole God thing was not necessary. Newton had described the universe as a machine. Darwin pulled the ghost out of the machine. And basically all you have left is these hollow monuments. And it's you Germans, or broader, you Western Christians, you're the ones who killed God. So Nietzsche's whole point is, I'm a messenger. I'm not here telling you God is dead as if I did something to you, which he's often interpreted as. It's not what he's saying at all. Nietzsche's saying, you guys are the ones who abandoned the God. None of you believes in that God anymore. You don't believe in a God who can do miracles. You don't believe in a God who can do creation anymore. It's just this false front. And that's what the hammer's for. To go around and show what a facade it is. And what's happening, where the laughter comes from, he's pointing out, as he comes into the culture and tells everybody, oh, by the way, God dead, we all killed him. He's basically saying, you haven't really acted this out. If you want to understand why I am fascinated with Nietzsche, why I've always thought he's one of the more interesting philosophers, he's the most ruthlessly consistent atheist there ever has been. All this notions about atheists, being moral and be a moral person. There's nobody better than Niezsche than cutting through that. He hates the utilitarians, just shreds them. He really ripped into Marx, and this to give you an idea how viciously he ripped into Marx, even though they were both fans of Darwin in certain ways. Niezsche basically, to use our slang, he called him a closet Christian. Boy, that was bad. It doesn't get much worse than that. What's all this concern about the masses and the poor? That's that old Christian garbage. We killed God. And once you kill God, then you have no more good and evil. All these things, as Plato had, values, truth, science, all of this stuff that came from above, that provided meaning, that provided rationality, that provided all of the things that Western culture is built on, is gone. You guys just haven't faced up to the consequences yet. And the consequence first is not more freedom yet, although he's certainly aiming for that. He's following this German quest for freedom. The real move first is nihilism. And he takes the old Greek word for nothing, nihil, and he basically says it's more than just a nothingness. It's a loss of meaning, value, truth, sight, all the things that God gave us, or more critically, that the idea of God gave us, has all collapsed. And you haven't faced up to it yet. In some rather chilling passages, he describes what's going to happen to Europe as it finally discovers that all of its idols are just empty. They have no meaning. What's going to happen when Europe discovers they've killed God? And he talks about this incredible violence he anticipates, which in 30 to 40 years exactly does happen. And you could argue that 100 million people are going to die within 60 years of Niezsche hitting the asylum. World War I and World War II are going to destroy Europe. The good Germans are wearing Gott mit uns, God with us, on their belt buckles in both wars, but their God was gone. Their God was dead. And that's Nietzsche's principal argument. Next, please. What does it mean once God is dead? Must we not ourselves become gods simply to be worthy of it? Now you're getting a clue as to the term of what's really going on here. There has never been a greater deed, and whosoever shall be born after us, for the sake of his deed, he shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Next. Okay, what's going on? With the death of God becomes the birth of the free man, the autonomous man, the man who, instead of having to worry about what some alleged higher being does, is now free to create himself. And Nietzsche's whole point about there is no good and evil was not to say that you couldn't say that some things are good and evil. You could still talk that way, although he wondered about whether you were pathologically, disturbed or something if you talked that way. Nietzsche's argument then was, you can choose whatever you want. You just can't say it comes from above. You shouldn't ever say that's a sign towards decadence again. If you want to say that it comes and you choose it for yourself, fine and dandy. So Niezsche says out of this nihilistic period, out of this time where there's just this massive violence as the culture rearranges its own thought and tries to get away from this idea of God and what's going to happen next, will come an Übermensch. It's often translated the overman or the superman, a strong man. A man who will rise up above this nihilistic swamp. He will have his own values. In Nietzsche's language, he will transcend all values. He will rise above all other values. He will impose his own values by sheer will to power. Nietzsche's teacher for a while, Schopenhauer, talked about life as kind of in a Darwinian sense as will to survive. For Niezsche, it was will to power. And he has this illustration of the plant man. Mankind is a plant. And all these concerns for the weak people of the world and stuff like that, those are just weeds. Actually, the language that Margaret Sanger would later pick up. These are just weeds that are choking off the plant man. For the plant man to get strong and has to get rid of all this slave morality, kindness, humility, all this kind of stuff that Niezsche hated, and has to restore the kind of values, interestingly enough, martial values, military values, although Niezsche himself was opposed to most of the militaristic movements in Germany. He was always talking this way, that this is what the plant needed to be strong, to be survive. Why? So they could affirm the world no matter what comes. That's the strength he was looking for. Sheer will to power to be able to affirm whatever happens to you. Total autonomy. Total freedom. As Janice was saying, I worked as a missionary for the Conservative Baptists for many years in going to psychic fairs, still do all this kind of stuff, but we go to psychic fairs, Buddhist temples, all sorts of New Age bookstores, fun places like this, and after reading a couple hundred of their books and talking to thousands of people, at a certain point you realize what the New Age is. If you just remove all the metaphysical silly stuff, and there's a zillion varieties, what the New Age basically is people shaking their fists at God saying, I want to do what I want to do, and I don't want anybody to tell I'm wrong. It's really not that hard to understand. And every once in a while they'll be honest about it. Probably one of the better examples of this is a very famous New Age futurist, Barbara Marx Hubbard, raised Christian like almost everybody else I talk to is. And Barbara has this book called The Hunger of Eve. And the idea, there's an apple on the cover of the book, and the apple's been bitten into, and inside the apple is the universe. And the idea is that when Eve, and again, if you're familiar with Mormon thinking, you see the parallel, when Eve bit into the apple, it wasn't a bad thing, it was a good thing. Lucifer then becomes our friend, our brother, our guide, as it were, opening up the full universe and all our own human potentiality, all this kind of stuff. But if you read the whole book, there's two parallels to it. As she's in this marriage, she got raised in the Christian church, she gets married, there's this metaphysical track where she's leaving Christian thought and she's getting into the New Age type thinking. And then there's another track where she's really getting bored of her marriage. She's got kids, she's doing the suburban housewife thing, it's leave it to beaver time, and that's really boring her. And as you watch the two tracks go through the book, the alleged upper track and the real track down below, at the end, when she finally has gotten past all this Christian silliness, is the exact same time that she decides, hey, she can blow off her marriage because there's several other guys she wants to have sex with, and that's what happens. So I said, well, really, you're saying something not that hard to understand. It's not about metaphysics. It's about the rebellion of the human heart, the heart that says, I want to do what I want. I don't want anybody to tell me I'm wrong. One of the things that my dissertation is relating to is the fact that Niezsche was fascinated with Eastern religion, and I don't think it's accidental that so many of the postmodern writers, in particular Niezsche, Heidegger, and then Foucault, were all into Zen, at least for different parts of their life. Postmodern and New Age thought really harmonize in all sorts of ways. So in a postmodern, so-called postmodern culture like today, Eastern religion will flow. It just goes right along hand in hand, and that's not accidental. It goes on all over the place. So what are you left with? What is this truth thing, then, that used to come from above that now has to come from within? No, back one. What is truth? This is his famous illustration. A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, embellished, poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. So we make them up, we put them out there, and after a while people forget where they come from. They think they're absolute. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten is what they are. Metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power. Coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as yet we've heard only of the obligation imposed by society, that it should exist. We must have absolutes. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors. In moral terms, the obligation to lie according to fixed convention, to lie herd-like in a style obligatory for all. So what is truth? It's something we made up so that we all be good members of the good little lemmings, members of the herd, and we can all be comfortable for ourselves. Now, as different strains come out of this whole thought, especially in somebody like Foucault, what you see for him is that truth really is a choice to get power over your life. And Foucault puts this in all sorts of different terms, especially as it comes to sexual ethics and how we understand this. Any time for the postmodern type person, they hear this word that I have truth, they translate that into saying, you're trying to get power over me. That's Foucault's reading of Nietzsche's on this point. You're creating a conversation, as it were. You're creating different sentences and paragraphs and thoughts which are intended to tell me how I have to live. You want power. So when you walk to your friend, in a coffee shop or something, hey, I want to tell you the truth about Jesus Christ. Oh, whoa. You're not telling me what's right and wrong. You're not telling me that you're right and I'm wrong. You're not going to tell me that you can have power over me. So there comes this famous line from Lyotard about the suspicion, the hermeneutics of suspicion and the suspicion of meta-narratives. Any claim to truth, then, is really a claim for power, and it really comes out of Nietzsche. Next one is this idea of perspectivalism. There's different ways of saying this. Some of his actual words. There are no facts, only interpretation. You cannot read Derrida, and in certain ways you cannot read Brian McLaren without understanding that's all he's really saying. There are no absolute facts. There's multiple layers. Derrida is not really a postmodernist as much as he's a post-structuralist. The structuralists, who were affected almost all the sciences in different departments, the structuralists were arguing that you could have multiple meanings for some words, that some words were transposable. You could use, like greatness and Yankees almost in the same sentence. They mean the exact same thing. Okay. Oh, I didn't even talk about semiotics, the sign, the signifier, the signified, all this silly nonsense. One of my signs up here is a sign of blessing, of God's blessing upon the earth, of goodness, and all that's right in the world, that. And then there's another sign, this, a sign of oppression, of subjectation, of a lack of freedom, proof that the devil can create. Whatever way you want to say this is what I have here in my hand. I was going to wear a suit this morning. Many of you don't believe I have one. It's actually at the dry cleaners right now, and I was going to rush over this morning and pick it up, and then I decided, wait a second, there has not, and I think this is the first time I can say this for EM&R, there has not been a single plenary speaker wearing a tie this whole weekend. Far be it from me to break that. Of all people, far be it from me to do this. So I put this sign of oppression up here where y'all can be oppressed by it. Again, there are no facts, only interpretation. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. And every word is a prejudice. Again, if you read Derrida and you read basically McLaren, you hear about this language. That language is a prison. If you read Derrida's Of Grammatology, his most famous book, that's the theme. That we cannot communicate because each culture constructs its own language. They do their own language games. It's not even possible for us to really understand. And this leads us to a critical point, which we're going to get to in just a second here. Next one. Okay, let's skip through the where God came from. That's just his Jewish rant. Here we go. Whoop, back. Heidegger hated technology. I guess that's postmodern too. Well, you did it again. Next. Yes. No. The other way. Here we go. We have killed him. Another one of his famous quotes. Lightning and thunder require time. The lights of the stars require time. Deeds require time, even after they are done. Before they can be seen and heard, this deed is even more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. What is his point in this? He has this illustration of the Buddha's shadow, which is an old Buddhist fairy tale about how allegedly the shadow in which the Buddha, in the cave in which he died, was there for hundreds of years and people could go see it. And he says the death of God also has a shadow. And it will be a long time coming, but you will start to see it. You will see the reaction as the culture starts to figure out what they've done. We threw away this God, and now we're going to be in this mess. And Nietzsche says that's what you're going to see over time. And I would say that the postmodern move is illustrative of that whole idea, that eventually over time people start taking these ideas to their natural conclusion. There is no imposer of morality or value or truth or science or anything else. There is only us. So when the death of God becomes the birth of the free man, and I want to point out next how the death of the author, one of the central themes of postmodern thought, is a reflection of that very idea. Move it up a little, Don. Next. One more. Boom. Most people have heard of Derrida and Foucault. You haven't heard of Roland Barthes. He's one of the really important, as you can say, there's postmodern thinkers, but probably more than anybody, Barthes' early article in the 60s about the death of the author is reflective of what Nietzsche is really seeking here. Watch what he's really saying here, what it means to be an author and what it means to talk about the death. To give a text an author and assign a single corresponding interpretation to it is to impose a limit on that text. Now, you have to understand what we're talking about here. When we talk about the death of the author in the postmodern context, all right, and we're going through Heidegger to all sorts of other different interesting characters. But what they're really saying is when a poet writes a poem, a singer has a song, an artist does a painting, somebody writes a book, somebody writes a story, a letter. It doesn't matter what it is. That's all text in this particular conversation. And what it means is that since, as Derrida has described things, we are stuck in our own communities. This is kind of like group existentialism instead of singularity existentialism, where I, the existing, individual matter. That's Kierkegaard, another existentialist. This is group. Our community's subjectivity, our community's perspectivalism basically keeps us from understanding whatever the heck you're saying. We couldn't possibly begin to know what you're saying. You come from a different place, a whole different school of thought, different customs, different language especially, and those things are prisons, and we can't really break out of those prisons. So for you to say something, classic hermeneutics, science of interpretation, was trying to find out what the author had to mean. And again, it wasn't necessarily related to the Bible. It's in art and all sorts of other schools of thought as well. There's no interest in that anymore because you're from such a different place and such a different time and such a different language, blah, blah, blah. I can't begin to know. And I don't want to know. That's really what this is different. It's not just saying we can't know. It's saying I don't want to know. Why is it saying that? Well, because it would be limiting. Now read the next thought here. Barth draws an analogy between text and textiles, declaring that a text is a tissue or a fabric of quotations drawn from innumerable centuries of culture, rather than from one individual experience. This, again, one of the reasons why Buddhism is so popular with postmodern types is that Buddhism and postmodernism both deny that there's an actual existing permanent self, a you. You're just a pastiche that changes constantly in both these schools of thought. There's really no you. So what was you 5 minutes ago is not you today. So to talk about a you means nothing in both groups. And that's in essence what he's saying here. You're not really a singularity, individual. You are something that's just constantly shifting and forming. The essential meaning of a work depends on the impressions of the reader rather than the passions or tastes of the writer. A text's unity lies not in its origin or its creator, but in its destination or its audience. Derrida, Foucault both wrote after this and just exploded. And by the way, this is taught at many of the Christian seminaries and Christian schools around the country. It leads to reader response. What's the next one, Don? Oh, let me get this one. Wait, back. Back one more, Don, sorry. There. Barth's articulation of the death of the author is, however, the most radical and most drastic recognition of the severing of authority and authorship. Instead of discovering a single theological meaning, the message of the author or God, readers of text discover that writing in reality constitute a multidimensional space, which cannot be deciphered, only disentangled. Refusing to assign a secret ultimate meaning to text liberates what may be called an anti-theological activity, an activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse meaning is, and this is their own quote, in the end, to refuse God and His hypostases, reason, science, and law. Everything that had been the center of Western culture died with that God. The implication of Barth's radical vision of critical reading are indicative of the inherently political structure or nature of this vision, which reverses the balance of authority and power between author and reader. Like the dethroning of a monarchy, the death of the author clears political space for the multi-voice populace at large, ushering the long-awaited birth of the reader. And this is exactly what Niezsche was arguing, that when God dies, man becomes free. And this is just the literary version of when the author dies. Then it no longer entangled to trying to figure out what the apostle meant in 1 Corinthians 6 or something like this. What matters is what I and my community think it means. We bring our own language, we bring our own cultural experience, we bring all our stuff to the table. And so I decide that 1 Corinthians 6, from the black, lesbian, Wiccan community, means X. It doesn't matter if that's what anybody else thinks it means, and it certainly doesn't matter what Paul thought, because the reader is supreme. The reader is free. My creativity, my autonomy are on full display now. And by the way, at DU, where I'm finishing my PhD, Iliff Seminary is connecting school to that, and I had to take 2 classes at Iliff. Boy, was that fun. And this is the kind of thing that passes for master's thesis and for some of the doctoral theses that are coming up. The black, lesbian, Wiccan community's understanding of X passage of the Bible. So if you took all those kind of classes where you were trying to learn what the author said, boy, you've just missed the boat completely. You were being limited in your understanding. You're trying to assume that you can understand like there's a God's eye view anymore. And as Nietzsche's already pointed out, nobody believes in the God's eye view anymore. We're just going to live out the ramifications of it. We're going to now live with the consequences of what it means to say there is nobody up there giving meaning. And so we celebrate it. That's why I said it's not seen as a bad thing. It's a celebration. We are finally free. Another interesting interpreter of Nietzsche is Jean Paul Sartre, much more serious atheist as opposed to the pretend pagans and Christians who are followers of Kierkegaard. But Sartre said, yes, it's true. We are completely free. And I'm sick. In fact, this book, Nausea, that he wrote was based on this whole idea. And Nietzsche's point was true. We are free. And therefore, every morning I get up and I realize I have no purpose, I have no meaning, there's no reason to do anything. And so in the true spirit of nihilism that Nietzsche had talked about, he says, I'm sick. There's nothing to get up for. There's no reason to live. Next. Here's the corresponding idea to the authorship, to the death of the author, reader response. Reader response theory recognizes the reader as an active agent who imparts real existence to the work and completes its meaning through interpretation. Remember, that's all we have, is interpretation. Reader response criticism argues that literature should be viewed as a performing art in which each reader creates his or her own possibly unique text-related performance. If some of you wondered a few years ago why when you read the Jesus Seminar, folks, whether it's Croissant or Marcus Borg, as the comment came out from many critics of their work, is that every one of these guys painted a Jesus that seemed to be just like them. I understand that's exactly what's going on. And as many people have pointed out in critique of this, you don't have a death of the author, you have the death of the text as well. The text is not necessary, because basically all I'm here to do is tell my story, and the text is just a thing that I'm going to use to mold and shape my story. Total autonomy, total freedom. As I said at the beginning, the lust for freedom in all the wrong places. God is dead, the author is dead, the text now disappears, and all that's left is me putting on a show. Basically, what Ergen was saying last night, the birth of the celebrity is an amazing. I mean, watching CNN last night, and both CNN channels and Fox News was Anna Nicole Smith 24/7. Like she's ever done an important thing. It's just an amazing phenomenon, how that passes for news. And every facet of her life is dragged out to the public. And you can see this with celebrity after celebrity. And I will also agree with this point about postmodernism being dead. And this is the sad thing about the emerging church. Like Christians always do, we always grab onto the culture 10 years after something is passé and then decide it's the new exciting thing. Now, as I get into the emerging church consequence of all this kind of jumping on all this kind of stuff, I realize that speakers are supposed to give the requisite, well, I do want to say these good things. I have nothing good to say. I'm going to agree with the rabbis as they looked at the Quran, as the story goes. What is good here is not new. What is new here is not good. I have no use for Christians saying that the postmodern emerging connection is somehow a good thing for the church and we have to learn from it. I'm just amazed, and as you'll see in my reaction to some of this kind of stuff, that this is a pool we think is something that has something to offer us is an amazing thing to me. Again, I don't think the great majority, in fact, I would argue that virtually all of the emerging people have never read Derrida, nor have they read Heidegger, nor have they read Niezsche. They just don't really know what they're talking about. They have an interpretation of a third-level interpretation they still don't know. So many inconsistencies in all of this. My one professor, who's the head of my committee, had a Niezsche class. It was the third Niezsche class I'd been involved with, and he just hated my paper. Boy, he just ripped and teared and shred. And he's a big Niezsche fan. And I am too, but in a whole different way. And I said, as we're dialoguing back and forth, as he just ripped my paper, I said, on the basis of Niezsche alone, how do you say that I'm interpreting him wrong? I'm just curious. How do you, as a good Nietzschean, ever argue that what I say is wrong? That's just my interpretation. That's what Nietzsche said, isn't it? That's all it is. Next. Arbeit macht frei. Some of you might remember the cultural reference. Well, a few. Work makes free over most of the Nazi death camps. Freedom is what the Germans sought. Auschwitz is what they got. The search for freedom, especially from God, inevitably leads to an Übermensch, the Superman who rises out of the nihilistic vacuum, transcends all values, and makes his own values stand through the sheer force of his own will to power. Hitler was only one of many to play this out. How many others have we had in just the last 50 years? Übermensch after Übermensch after Übermensch. They all have names, but they're all really the same thing. One person who rises above. There are no boundaries. There's nobody telling them they're right or wrong. Through sheer force of their will, they impose their values on others. Welcome to the nihilistic playground. Next. Well, I'm going to in the spirit of the whole thing, in the spirit of both Niezsche, I'm going to give you a bunch of aphorisms, just different disconnected thoughts which sort of might relate to each other. And I'm going to become part of the conversation. And again, I know this is the requisite spot where you have to say, well, not all emerging say this. I could care less about that game. Whether they're part of the village, the conversation, the emerging movement, or they're just emergent, or all these different distinctions that people are playing with all the time. All I'm pointing out is that I'm trying to show the well where this all comes from. And if they want to attach themselves by name, then that's their fault. And if they don't like my saying, hey, it's just an interpretation. The classic philosopher wrestled with the problem of his disciples. Save me from my disciples, Socrates once cried out. I don't think it applies anymore. I thought about 2 years ago, I was writing my first newsletter I was writing on the emerging church. I thought, boy, wait till the next generation gets these guys and takes it farther. If you saw what happened from Barth to Bultmann, you realize that the next generation is always going to apply it more stringently, more strictly, more coherently and logically. We don't need that now. Virtually with every passing book. In fact, since Don Carson wrote his book on becoming conversant, I would argue that McLaren's and some of these guys have gotten much, much worse. In less than 2 years. It's like every 6 months there's a whole new level of heresy introduced into the conversation and accepted in the conversation. It's amazingly fast. Next. Missional is the hot word. Just talk to 5 people, let alone 100, and see what you get that word to mean. It is the perfect postmodern word right now in the Christian church. It means everything and nothing, and at all points in between. It just depends literally on who you talk to. But one of the things it rarely has to do, and especially in the emerging bunch, is it rarely has anything to do with actual historic mission, that you would actually share the gospel with people. Consistent with its approach, a lot of these big names have become virtual, if not stated, universalists. The first guy I ran into was a professor at CCU, had gone to a conference at Wheaton in 1993 or 4. I had no idea, I had not heard the word postmodern. I was studying Niezsche, but I didn't know any of this connection yet. And he comes back with a new crusade. This is the way to save the church. In fact, if we don't do this, the church will die out. And I was like, what are you talking about? Tell me about this. And within 2 years, this guy, who had once been in apologetics ministry in Denver, was a graduate of student of my seminary, in fact. Within 2 years, he was telling his students that they could come to God through Buddha, through Vishnu, through Krishna. It did not matter. All at a conservative Christian college. I got fired for opposing that, but doctrinal statements, they don't mean anything. Seen often as being authentic Jesus followers, new language here, living in the postmodern culture. Well, Christ-like behavior is good, but how can we know that it's right? How do we know even what it looks like? It's one of these amazing things, like if you get into the open theist, idea, there's these supposedly bipolar stuff that they got from the process theologians. Well, there's things that God can change and things that He can't change. And I'm like, why would you draw the line there? If God can change His mind, why can't He decide that He no longer loves me but now hates me? And you can use the exact kind of text in the exact same way that the open theist guys do to come to that conclusion. Well, in the same sense, if Christ-like following is allegedly a good thing, how do I know what that looks like? I look at the stories that I'm encouraged to look at, the red letter Christian stuff. I look at the stories, but since there's multiple layers of meaning to this, well, you'll see where we go with this. Next. If text is an interpretation, all text, except for Derrida, Foucault, and those guys, their text is not open to interpretation. It's amazing. If all text is an interpretation open to multiple readings as asserted by the Pomos and emergent village types, then why take care of the poor? Isn't eating the poor just as justified an interpretation? Not that justification is needed in this game. If it's all open to interpretation, then what does missional really mean? Why should I go in the neighborhood? Why shouldn't I rip off the neighborhood? Keep on. If some interpretations are, quote, better than others, then isn't a canon being snuck in through the back door? I have, to my great shame, 3 kids that came to my youth group years ago when I was a youth pastor who got their PhDs long before me, and I hate them all, and it's not right. But one of my students, who now teaches philosophy at Creighton University, got his PhD, wrote an article that was published by JETS, Journal for the ETS, and it's all about Derrida as a prophet. And it's the first time I'd run into that whole thing, and I'm like, what the heck? And I reviewed the whole thing for him before he had it published. And if you look in that article, if you look in the archive, you find it says, well, some say I'm always the opposing guy on virtually everything he says. But Derrida has become a champion of of that which is not left into the conversation. Derrida is a champion of the marginalized, the people of color and women and others who have been oppressed, and they're in the margins of the text. They're not even written about. They're outside the text, was kind of this language. And so Derrida is their champion, so he becomes a moral prophet along the lines of Jeremiah. And my reaction is exactly the opposite. If you take Derrida seriously, there are no absolute ethics or concerns. Okay, if the frat boy wants to date and rape his sorority girl, who are we to say that it's wrong? The best we can say is, well, I don't really think that's comfortable, and we would never do it, but I can't say you're wrong. So ethics fly out. So the prophetic voice is lost, as we'll get to in a second. Structuralism limited the number of possible variants, limited their freedom, so the post-structuralists moved on. More variants, layers of multiple meanings to be deconstructed. In a word, freedom. The villagers are now free to depart from all oppressive doctrines and dogmas, and they say this repeatedly. The postmodern emerging thing has nothing to do with which way we do style, whether we have candles or whether we do a labyrinth or anything like that. That's the outside, and it means nothing, and they say so. And if you read Tony Jones, you read Doug Padgett, you read Bell, and you read McLaren, all these guys, it's all about theology. It's not about the method. It's about the fact that theology itself, these concepts that we hang on to, they themselves are in flux. They're all liquid. They're all just matters of interpretations, and we don't need to interpret them in the same way we used to. Next. Carson's book is ridiculed as, quote, breathtakingly bad by Tony Jones and his crew. How on the basis of perspectivalism can you say this? Isn't that just his interpretation on their own standing? Are there some interpretations which are more than just interpretation? Again, the hidden canon or measuring stick or objective standard seems to be sneaking into the alleged conversation. Also seen is the ridicule aimed at the fundamentalist, McLaren's particular hate, and the church growth crowd, the plastic plant analogy, which has become so popular with these guys, the lack of authentic relationship, the church growth mentality. Well, again, you don't have to be an emerging postmodern type to criticize the church growth proof. This room is proof of that. Most of us have been criticizing that stuff for years. But I just find it fascinating. On the basis of perspectivalism, subjectivity, everybody's only got their opinion. On whatever way you say that, it's the same conclusion. How do you have the right to criticize anybody else? Where do you get off doing that? Who are you to say the fundamentalists are wrong? Or the Rick Warren crowd is wrong? On the basis of this. So somewhere in there seems to be a hidden canon coming in through the back door. Next. Another one of the big points, and my young friend put this one on me, epistemic humility. See, that's so arrogant to say you have knowledge or that you're certain. Because you fundamentalist types, you guys say that you know everything. I've never met anybody like that. I read once, maybe Hegel thought that way, and he truly was that arrogant. But I've never met anybody else that thinks that way. And Gordon Lewis and I have this conversation that's gone on for many years according to this whole thing. And the idea is to say that you have no knowledge of anything is just as extreme as to say you have all knowledge. In fact, I would call it equally arrogant. I know that I know nothing with certainty, and I'm quite certain that you know nothing as well. Somebody help me understand this. Just as arrogant as the straw man it attacks. Next. If, quote, authentic relationship is the desired good, then how can one know this? Since there can be no, I'm going to swear, foundational, end quote, principles, which could describe what that means, then the relationship between slave master and slave can be seen as authentic as well. It's real, it's intense, it's personal, it's vicious, but hey, that's just interpretation. As well as the molester victim, murderer, murdered. Since there's no text to give me guidelines on what an authentic relationship looks like, you have a hard time arguing against this sort of thing. Again, why take care of the poor? Why not eat the poor? You're really rubbing in the same spot. If Christian morality about homosexuality is up in the air, then why isn't Christian morality about taking care of the poor? If this is all about social justice, how can I know what to do in social justice? I don't take a back seat on social justice for anybody. I don't think any of these characters have the right to talk that way, unless they do. It's hundreds and hundreds of these fundamentalist-type churches running down to Biloxi and New Orleans and helping out. It's the emerging church has a different game. Next. If ethical or social justice concerns are tied to the authenticity of the relationship, then why would one go to the well of Niezsche, Heidegger, and Foucault to find what those men all hated, Christ-like behavior? They despised it. You cannot read Nietzsche without seeing this over and over again. His hatred of humility, meekness, all this kind of stuff. Why take care of the other? Why not eat the other? Who is to say? I find this one fascinating. Nietzsche just says it flat out. God is dead. We've killed him. There is no good and evil. Heidegger comes along. Here's one of the most important philosophers by virtually everybody. It's the worst book I ever read was Being in Time. Other than Ryle's book, Hippo in the Garden. I have to say that. But here's Being in Time. Here's a guy writing this full, incredible array for like 50 years and doesn't write hardly a word about ethics, which if you look from Plato to Aristotle all the way up, everybody has a section in their philosophy of ethics. You're not considered a good thinker if you don't have a section on ethics. And yet here's Heidegger with virtually no ethics. I don't think that's accidental. I don't think it's accidental at all. And one of the sort of postmodern writers who's been so critical of Derrida for his dependence on Heidegger and Nietzsche is a guy named Levinas, who's a rabbinical scholar. He writes in the same way these guys does, but his point is ethics is first. Heidegger said it's all about being. Levinas says, no, it's about ethics. Trying to restore that back into the continental theater. My point is to say this. If I'm looking for a marriage of thought, why do I go to the least ethical man I can think of? Heidegger was an unrepentant Nazi till his dying day. He never once said what he did was wrong. He denied that he was part of the Nazi party. He fired his own professor, Husserl, because he was Jewish. When Heidegger got control of the university, fired him. Husserl is also an important part of phenomenology. Anyways, I have a hard time saying that these are guys I want to go to teach me about ethical concern and social justice. Next. While claiming to be about social justice and other causes, the real prophetic voice, you shall not, is lost in the pomo consumerist, whatever. In fact, if you read a lot of the postmodern guys, Frederick James or some of these other guys, they're just analysts of consumer culture now. It's amazing to see how this has gone into. What should one say to those who steal from the widow and the orphan? I'm not sure about this, but maybe you shouldn't. Well, I mean, we wouldn't, but I can't really say you shouldn't. But I sort of don't like what you're doing, but well, whatever. That is a prophetic voice. I'm sure that would inspire many to do the right thing. Next. Not just methodology, as Brett Kunkel has pointed out, but theology is in flux, transition, liquid. While hiding behind the skirts of the creeds, as all of these guys are saying, they've attacked the Trinity, hell, biblical norms concerning homosexuality, the substitutionary atonement, inerrancy, the nature and personhood of God. And that's just in 6 years. Again, we don't have to wait for the disciples to follow this up. It's an amazing thing. Every one of these guys claims they believe in the creeds, but language is such an interesting game now, isn't it? This is what's so distinct between them and the old-fashioned liberals. No, I deny this. Now it's all murky. I can affirm the creed and deny all the definitions, all at the same time, and without a shred of conscience getting in the way. You take some of these things. In fact, probably the first the first postmodern emerging website I ever saw was 8 years ago. I went on the Ooze, Spencer Burke, and I had never seen anything like this, and he was linking up to all this, what I consider really New Age stuff, like the labyrinth and all these different things, and we go to the psychic fair, and then a couple years later, we go to the psychic fair, we see the labyrinths. And then a couple years later, we start going to the Christian Ministries Convention and seeing the labyrinths and start, things have changed. This is all acceptable now. Well, Burke was the first one I saw that kind of thing with. Now Burke has come out in his newest book and basically argued that he doesn't believe in the Trinity. He's a universalist. And by the way, he doesn't even believe God is a person anymore. And he's a huge historic part of the conversation. Are there multiple voices rising up and saying, this really is heresy, you're out of here? No, he's a trusted brother. It's all the same. Why? Because culture dictates theology. Culture tells us what we believe, and it changes literally overnight. Most postmodern readings come from a flawed analysis of the Enlightenment or modernity. Just as there is no modernism, that's a term, guys, but only a collection of thinkers who lived at a certain time, all of whom disagree with each other passionately. You cannot read Descartes and Hume and Kant, let alone Voltaire and all these other Enlightenment thinkers, and think that there's some thing that they all agreed on, which is how the postmodern writers tend to analyze it. All right? They didn't agree. They despised each other. They attacked each other's positions. Different writers they disagree with each other passionately. So postmodernism is much the same. Different writers who live at a different time who also disagree with each other. When you start reading Derrida, and then you read Foucault, then you read Jameson, you read Ricoeur and Lyotard, they don't agree on hardly anything. I am a postmodernist, I'm not a postmodernist, what day is it? It just goes back and forth. On this basis, it is hard to make sense out of the emerging analysis that modernism is the problem of the church and postmodernism the cure. These words don't really mean much. Next. The lust for freedom or autonomy, which is ratcheted up in the Enlightenment, has come to ultimate fruition in the postmodern or post-structuralist age. The emerging marriage of Christianity with postmodernism is no better than Schleiermacher's marriage of Christianity with modernity. The latter produced the bastard child of liberal Christianity, while the former, interesting enough, looks to be producing the exact same thing. While allegedly adverse to all things modernistic, the Pomo crowd, for some reason, is in incredible harmony with the writings of Darwin, Freud, and Marx. Every one of the serious postmodern writers is a leftist, hard left. And I don't think that's accidental at all. Who could be more modern than those guys? The emerging authors made their bones, a little mafia talk for you folks, critiquing the program-driven methodologies of the church growth crowd. Have we seen the circle drawn complete with the endorsement by Rick Warren now in place? Isn't that an interesting phenomenon? Plastic plants, inauthentic church growth stuff. Now Rick Warren endorses them. Perhaps Rick is just seeing another niche marketing effort. Same stuff. Next. Jeremiah 2 warns about drinking brackish water from broken wells instead of the living waters from the Lord himself. Should there not be a concern in the wider church itself that a movement that is driven by the teachings of Niezsche and Heidegger and the Derrida food chain will be no better than one influenced by Peter Drucker and Peter Berger, or the one influenced by Freud, Maslow, and Jung, or the one driven by Aristotle, Plato, and Plotinus? Just another bad marriage the church has gotten itself into. Next. Finally, if there is some friend of the conversation who should hear this talk and be offended, then I must ask you in advance, how are you offended? How could that be? If it's only my interpretation, why should you care? If it's wrong, and this is the key thing about how they attacked Carson, then whose interpretation is the correct one? And how do you assert that? Get back to me on that sometime. And all the extra periods are my gift to Brian McLaren, who seems to have lost them when he wrote his books. Let's pray, and if you have any questions, I can hang on. Father, thanks for your mercy and grace. And as we look at our culture going insane, and we look at the church going insane seemingly alongside, I'm just perplexed. Father, bring us back to your word. Bring us back to ultimate truth that we can all live by, and that our culture desperately needs to live by as well. Father, help us to love and speak the truth to these people as best as we can. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.